Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! Order. Statement, the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I would like to make a statement on the terrorist attack in Paris and the G20 in Turkey this weekend. On Paris, the Home Secretary gave the House the chilling statistics yesterday, and now we know that among the victims was a 36-year-old Briton, Nick Alexander, who was killed at the Bataclan. I know the thoughts and prayers of the whole House will be with the families and the friends of all those affected. On Saturday, I spoke to President Hollande to express the condolences of the British people and our commitment to help in whatever way we can. Mr. Speaker, after our horror and our anger must come our resolve and our determination to rid our world of this evil. So let me set out the steps we're taking to deal with this terrorist threat. The more we learn about what happened in Paris, the more it justifies the full spectrum approach that we've discussed before in this House. When you're dealing with radicalised European Muslims linked to ISIL in Syria and inspired by a poisonous narrative of extremism, you need an approach that covers the full range: military power, counter-terrorism expertise, and defeating the poisonous narrative that is the root cause of this evil. Let me take each in turn. First, we should be clear that this murderous violence requires a strong security response. That means continuing our efforts to degrade and destroy ISIL in Syria and Iraq, and where necessary, it means working with our allies to strike against those who pose a direct threat to the safety of British people around the world. Together, coalition forces have now damaged over 13,500 targets. We've helped local forces to regain 30% of ISIL territory in Iraq. We've helped to retake Kobani and push ISIL back towards Raqqa. And on Friday, Kurdish forces retook Sinjar. The UK is playing its part, training local forces, striking targets in Iraq, and providing vital intelligence support. Last Thursday, the United States carried out an airstrike in Raqqa, Syria, targeting Mohammed Edwazi, the ISIL executioner known as Jihadi John. This was a result of months of painstaking work in which America and Britain worked hand in glove to stop this vicious murderer. Mr. Speaker, it is important that the whole House understands the reality of the situation we are in. There is no government in Syria we can work with, particularly not in that part of Syria. There are no rigorous police investigations or independent courts upholding justice in Raqqa. We have no military on the ground to detain those preparing plots against our people. In this situation, we do not protect the British people by sitting back and wishing that things were different. We have to act to keep our people safe, and that is what this government will always do. Second, counter-terrorism here in the UK. Over the past year alone, our outstanding police and security services have already foiled no fewer than 7 terrorist plots right here in Britain. The people in our security services work incredibly hard. They are a credit to our nation, and we should pay tribute to them again in our House today. But now we must do more to help them in their vital work. So in next week's Strategic Defence and Security Review, we'll make a major additional investment in our world-class intelligence agencies. This will include over 1,900 additional security intelligence staff and more money to increase our network of counter-terrorism experts in the Middle East, in North Africa, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. At the G20 summit in Turkey this weekend, we agreed additional steps to better protect ourselves from the threat of foreign fighters by sharing intelligence and stopping them from travelling. We also agreed for the first time to work together to strengthen global aviation security. We need robust and consistent standards of aviation security in every airport in the world, and the UK will at least double its spending in this area. Third, to defeat this terrorist threat in the long run, we must also understand and address its root causes. That means confronting the poisonous ideology of Islamist extremism itself. As I've argued before, that means going after both violent and non-violent extremists. Those that sow the poison but stop short of actually promoting violence, they are part of the problem. We will improve integration, not least by inspecting and shutting down any educational institutions that are teaching intolerance. and will actively encourage reforming and moderate Muslim voices to speak up and challenge the extremists, as so many do. Mr. Speaker, it cannot be said enough that the extremist ideology is not true Islam. But it doesn't work to deny any connection between the religion of Islam and the extremists, not least because the extremists themselves self-identify as Muslims. There's no point denying that. What we need to do instead is to take apart their arguments and demonstrate how wrong they are. And in doing so, we need the continued help of Muslim communities and Muslim scholars. They are playing a powerful role, and I commend them for their absolutely essential work. We cannot stand neutral in this battle of ideas. We have to back those who share our values with practical help, funding, campaigns, protection, and political representation. This is a fundamental part of how we can defeat this terrorism, both at home and abroad. Mr. Speaker, turning to the G20 summit, there were also important discussions on Syria and on dealing with other long-term threats to our security, such as climate change. And let me briefly address those. On Syria, we discussed how we do more to help all those in desperate humanitarian need and how to find a political solution to the conflict. Britain, as has often been said, is already providing £1.1 billion in vital life-saving assistance. That makes us the second largest bilateral donor in the world. Last week we committed a further £275 million to be spent in Turkey, a country that is hosting over 2 million refugees. And in February, the United Kingdom will seek to raise further significant new funding by co-hosting a donors conference in London, together with Germany, Norway, Kuwait and the United Nations. But none of this is a substitute for the most urgent need of all, to find a political solution that brings peace to Syria and enables millions of refugees to return home. Yesterday, I held talks with President Putin. We reviewed the progress made by our foreign ministers in Vienna to deliver a transition in Syria. We still have disagreements. There are still big gaps between us, but there is progress. I also met with President Obama and European leaders at the G20, and we agreed some important concrete steps forward, including basing some British aircraft alongside other NATO allies at the airbase at Incirlik, if that is the decision of the North Atlantic Council that meets shortly. These would be in an air defence role to support Turkey at this difficult time. We also agreed to the importance of stepping up our joint effort to deal with ISIL in Iraq, in Syria, indeed wherever it manifests itself. Now, this raises important questions for our country. We must ask ourselves if we really are doing all we can be doing, all we should be doing, to deal with the threat of ISIL and the threat that it poses to us directly, not just through the measures we're taking at home, but by dealing with ISIL on the ground, in the territory that it controls. Now, we're taking part in airstrikes over Iraq, when we have struck over 350 targets, and significant action has been taken in the recent hours. But ISIL is not just present in Iraq. It operates across the border in Syria, a border that is meaningless to it, because ISIL, as far as ISIL is concerned, this is all one space. And it is in Syria, in Raqqa, that ISIL has its headquarters, and it is from Raqqa that some of the main threats against this country are planned and orchestrated. Raqqa, if you like, is the head of the snake. Over Syria, we're supporting our allies, the US, France, Jordan, and the Gulf countries, with intelligence, with surveillance, and with refueling. But I believe, as I've said many times before, we should be doing more. We face a direct and growing threat to our country, and we need to deal with it, not just in Iraq, but in Syria too. I've always said there's a strong case for us doing so. Our allies are asking us to do this, and the case for doing so has only grown stronger after the Paris attacks. We cannot expect, we should not expect, others to carry the burdens and the risks of protecting our country. Now, I recognise that there are concerns in this House. What difference would action by the UK really make? Could it make the situation worse? How does the recent Russian action affect the situation? How, above all, how would a decision by Britain to join strikes against ISIL in Syria fit into a comprehensive strategy for dealing with ISIL and a diplomatic strategy to bring the war in Syria to an end? I understand these concerns, and I know they must be answered. I believe they can be answered. Many of them were expressed in the recent report of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. My firm conviction is that we need to act against ISIL in Syria. There is a compelling case for doing so. It is for the government, I accept, to make that case to this House and to the country. I can therefore announce that as a first important step to do so, I will respond personally to the report of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I will set out our comprehensive strategy for dealing with ISIL, our vision for a more stable and peaceful Middle East. Now, this strategy, in my view, should include taking the action in Syria I've spoken about. And I hope that in setting out the arguments in this way, I can help build support right across this House for the action that I believe is necessary to take. That is what I'm going to be putting in place over the coming days, and I hope that colleagues from across the House will engage with that and make clear their views so we can have a strong vote in this House of Commons and do the right thing for our country. Now, finally, the G20 also addressed other longer-term threats to global security. In just 2 weeks' time, we will gather in Paris to agree a global climate change deal. This time, unlike Kyoto, it will include the USA and China. Here at this summit, I urge leaders to keep the ambition of limiting global warming by 2050 to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Every country needs to put forward its programme for reducing carbon emissions. And as G20 countries, we also need to do more to provide the financing that is needed to help poorer countries from around the world switch to greener forms of energy and to adapt to the effects of climate change. We also agreed we should do more to wipe out the corruption that chokes off development and deal with antimicrobial resistance. Corruption is the cancer at the heart of so many of the problems the world faces today, from migrants fleeing corrupt African states to corrupt governments undermining our efforts on global poverty by preventing people from getting the revenues and the services that are rightfully theirs. While if antibiotics stopped working properly, the antimicrobial resistance issue, millions of people in the world will die unnecessarily. So these are both vital issues on which the United Kingdom is taking a real lead. Mr. Speaker, let me conclude by returning to the terrorist threat. Here in the UK, the threat level is already severe, which means an attack is highly likely and will remain so. That is why we continue to encourage the public to remain vigilant. And we will do all we can to support our police and intelligence agencies as they work around the clock. The terrorist aim is clear. It is to divide us and to destroy our way of life. So now more than ever, we must come together and stand united, carrying on with the way of life that we know and that we love. Tonight, England will play France at Wembley. This match is going ahead. Our people stand together, as they have done so many times throughout history when faced with evil. And once again, together, we will prevail, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, which he kindly sent me a copy of earlier. Can I also thank him for the measured and careful tone of his public statements since the dreadful events of last Friday in Paris. In the face of such tragic events and the horror, anxiety and sorrow that have caused the British public to stand up in solidarity with the people of France, it's right that we take an approach of solidarity with them. The Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have talked of the importance of achieving consensus in our response to the attacks and achieve a common objective in trying to defeat ISIL. I agree with him, and the opposition stands ready to work with him and the government towards that end. And can I also thank him for arranging the National Security Advisor to brief colleagues from the front bench of the opposition last weekend. Can he assure me that the opposition and other parties will continue to be briefed on developments as they emerge? On behalf of these benches, I want to express my condolences and solidarity with the people of Paris in the wake of the horrific and unjustified attacks on the people who suffered in that city last Friday night. That solidarity extends to all victims of terrorism and conflict, whether they be in Paris, Beirut, Ankara, or in Syria itself. Absolutely nothing can justify the deliberate targeting of civilians by anyone, anywhere, ever. These contemptible attacks were an attempt to divide Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, peoples of all faiths and none. As they tried in London some years ago, they will fail. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I wish to take a moment to praise the efforts of work of emergency service workers in Paris and elsewhere who spring into action in these dreadful and very difficult situations and help to save life. It is easy to forget the extraordinary heroism of those involved in simply going to work, not knowing what will happen. It's not easy to drive an ambulance not knowing what you're going to find when you arrive at the scene. In my letter to François Hollande this weekend, I said that we stand united with his country in expressing our unequivocal condemnation of those involved in planning and carrying out these atrocities. The shocking events in Paris are a reminder to all of the ever-present threat of terrorism and indiscriminate violence. In this House, we also have a primary and particular duty to protect the people of this country and keep them safe. Yesterday, my right honourable friend, the member for Lee, pledged our support for the government in their efforts to do this, and that we reiterate again. While we welcome the sensible measures to make more funding available for our security services, to gather intelligence and expose and prevent plots, can he confirm that these will be balanced with the need to protect our civil liberties, which were so hard won in this country and so stoutly defended by many of us? They are part of what distinguishes us from many other regimes around the world, indeed regimes from which people are fleeing. The Right Honourable Member for Lee have said yesterday there should be protection in the forthcoming spending review of the policing budget and policing services that clearly will be playing a vital role on the ground in ensuring our communities are safe. Can the Prime Minister now confirm that he is willing to work with us to prevent cuts to our police force and ensure that they are able to continue with the protective work they have to do? Does he agree with the former Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Lord Blair, that it would be a disaster to axe police community support officers as they bring in vital intelligence from communities to help prevent attacks? And as a Member of Parliament for an inner-city community, I fully understand and appreciate the great work that Safer Neighbourhoods team and community policing teams do. As for community cohesion, we in Britain are proud to live in a diverse and multi-faith society, and we stand for the unity of all communities. There are over 2 million Muslims living in Britain, and they are as utterly appalled by the violence in Paris as anybody else. We've seen in the past, after atrocities like this, there can be a backlash against the Muslim and other communities. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and far-right racism have no place whatsoever in our society, our thinking, and I hope there will be no increase in any of that degree of intolerance as a result of what's happened in Paris. Will the Prime Minister set out in more detail the steps his government is taking to work with representative organisations of all of our faith communities to ensure that we achieve and strengthen community cohesion at these very difficult times? We must also ensure that those entering our country, whether they be refugees or visitors, are obviously appropriately screened. Will he confirm the Home Office will provide the border staff necessary to do this? It's also important in these circumstances that we maintain our humanitarian duty towards refugees. The Syrian refugees are fleeing the daily brutality of ISIL and Assad, and it's our duty to protect them, indeed our legal obligation under the 1951 Geneva Convention. I hope the Prime Minister will confirm that our obligation to maintain support for that convention and the rights of refugees will be undiminished by the events of the last few days. It's vital at a time of such tragedy and outrage not to be drawn into responses which feed a cycle of violence and hatred. President Obama has said that ISIS grew out of our invasion of Iraq, and it is one of its unintended consequences. Will the Prime Minister consider this as one of the very careful responses that President Obama has made recently on this matter? That makes it essential that any military response that might be considered not only has consent, but support of the international community and, crucially, the legality from the United Nations. Can I therefore welcome the Prime Minister's comments at the G20 yesterday when he said, "I think people want to know there is a whole plan for the future of Syria, for the future of our region, and it is perfectly right to say a few bombs and missiles won't transform the situation." Can I welcome his commitment to respond personally to the Foreign Affairs Committee report, which has been so carefully presented to the House and to the country? Will he confirm, therefore, that before bringing any motion to the House, he will provide full answers, as he's indicated he will, to the 7 questions raised by the Select Committee report? Would he also say more about the particular contribution that Britain has made to the Vienna talks on the future of Syria? They provide a basis for possibly some cautious optimism that there could indeed be a political future in Syria that involves a ceasefire and the ability of people eventually to be able to return home. Would he also say, and this is the final point I want to make on this, what more can be done to cut off supplies of weapons and external markets to ISIL? Weapons are being supplied to some of the most repressive regimes in the region. What is being done to ensure that they do not end up in even worse hands, including those of ISIL and some of the extremist jihadist groups in Syria? Also, what more can be done to bring to account those governments or organisations or banks that have funded these extremists or turned a blind eye to them? We need to know the financial trail by which ISIL gets its funding and indeed sells its oil. Quickly, other G20 issues. I wonder if the Prime Minister had a chance to congratulate the new Canadian Prime Minister on his election. He didn't mention it, but I'm sure he has. Will he also be aware that the current slowdown in the global economy is causing concern, and what discussions he's had with his Chancellor about the dangers of more demand being sucked out of the economy at this time? He mentioned in conclusion the climate change talks that will be going on in Paris in the next few weeks. They are very, very important indeed, and I welcome his commitment to concerning the problems of epidemics and the problems created by the lack of resistance to people from antibiotics. But will he also consider that cuts have been made to renewable energy in this country run directly counter to everything he said and everything his government says it wants to achieve at the climate change talks? We have to combat climate change globally, internationally, and here in Britain.
Can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his remarks and the tone that he is taking in trying to aim for greater consensus. Let me try and answer each of the questions in turn. First of all, on the issue of briefing on national security issues, that is something that is available to all Privy Councillors, and if it's not offered, then please do ask. That is the National Security Secretariat are there to help, and it's particularly important at these times of heightened alert. He's right to praise the emergency services in France. They did an amazing job, and it's very important to reiterate that ever since, and the Home Secretary did this yesterday, ever since the Mumbai attacks and more recently since the intelligence we had about the potential for marauding firearms attacks some years ago, a lot of work has been done in Britain to try and make sure we would be ready for any such attack. Can I thank him for his support for the security services? He's right to mention the vital importance of our civil liberties. They're part of what we're fighting to defend. On policing, we have protected counter-terrorism policing budgets throughout the last Parliament. We're going to do that through this Parliament, which I think is vital, and you can see the uplift that we're giving to our intelligence and security services, and we'll do what's necessary to make sure we keep our country safe. He's right to condemn anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and right-wing extremism. All of those issues are addressed in our counter-extremism paper, and we should be working with local communities, as he suggests, and we do, to make sure that they often lead in these debates. I think some of the things that have been said by Muslim clerics and Muslim leaders have made a huge difference in recent weeks. He asked about borders. We do have the opportunity to carry out screening and checks at our borders because we didn't join the Schengen no borders system, and we're not going to. And I think this shows once again the importance of having those border controls and using them to the best of our ability. In terms of the Syrian migrant programme, it is worth perhaps reminding the House that we are taking 20,000 Syrian refugees from the camps rather than from those who've already arrived in Europe, and this enables us to screen very carefully the people that we take. There's two levels of screening, first by UNHCR and then by the Home Office, to make sure that we're getting people who are genuinely fleeing persecution and would not pose a risk to our country. He asked about the genesis of ISIL, so-called Islamic State. What I would say to him is it is one of the branches of this violent Islamist extremism that we've seen in our world for more than the last 20 years. There's Boko Haram, there's Al-Qaeda, there's Al-Shabaab. And it is worth making the point, of course, that the first manifestations of this violent Islamist extremism, not least the Twin Towers attack, that happened before the invasion of Iraq. And I do think it's important we don't try to seek sort of excuses for what is a death cult. And a death cult that's been killing British citizens for many, many years. He rightly asks about the process in Vienna. We're a key part of that. The Foreign Secretary has been playing a very strong role in that, and Secretary of State John Kerry commended his work to me yesterday. He mentioned what I said yesterday about additional bombs and missiles only being able to go so far in Syria. Yes, that's right. I think Britain can do more, and Britain, because of our expertise and our targeting, actually can cut the number of civilian casualties when this action is taken. So I think that it would make a difference, but I believe, yes, alongside that, we also need a process that delivers a government in Syria that can represent all of the Syrian people. You can't defeat ISIL purely by a campaign from the air. You need to have a government in Iraq and a government in Syria that can be your partner in delivering good government to those countries and obliterating the death cult that threatens both us and them. The things go together. That's the point I'm making. He asks about cutting the supply of weapons and money. We are a key part of the international committee that is working on that. A large amount of ISIL's money comes from oil that it sells, not least to the Syrian regime. Another thing we'd be able to address more directly if we were taking part in the action in Syria. Finally, he asked if I met Justin Trudeau, the new Canadian Prime Minister. I did. I congratulated him on his victory, and he's coming to London very shortly to see the Queen, and also I'll be able to have a meeting with him, and I think they'll be very good partners on lots of issues where we work together. In terms of the economic slowdown, he's right that the forecasts for global growth are lower than what they were. Britain and America are the two countries that actually stand out in the advanced world of having more rapid economic growth, and we encourage others to take some of the steps that we've taken to deliver that growth. And finally, he asked about renewables and climate change. I would say to the House that the summit on climate change was disappointing. There's still quite a lot of opposition from some countries to really put in place the things that are needed for a good deal in Paris. But I think Britain can say we really have played an important role in getting a good European deal. And in terms of renewable energy, if you look at what has happened over the last 5 years, there's been nothing short of a renewable energy revolution in Britain.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The continued reach and activity of ISIS represents a monumental international security challenge. The aim was to degrade and contain them, but they are not contained. So can I thank my right honourable friend for what he said yesterday about the need to cut off the financial supplies to ISIS, about the need to deal with the narrative over values, and what he has said today about the need to join our allies in taking action over Syria as well as Iraq. And he is absolutely correct when he says that no military campaign of this nature has ever been won from the air alone. So can I say to him that we may yet require an international coalition on the ground of the sort that we required to remove Saddam from Kuwait? And can I ask him today to simply rule nothing out and give no comfort to ISIS, because these people hate us not because of what we do, but because of who we are?
Well, can I thank him for his support? And obviously we should be in the business of working out what we can do and what would make a difference rather than what we can't do. But it's my contention that in the end, the best partner we can have for defeating ISIL in Iraq is the Iraqi government, and the best partner we could have in Syria is a reformed government in Syria without Assad at its head that could credibly represent all of the Syrian people and be a partner for getting rid of this death cult which threatens the Syrian people as well as the rest of us.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and my thanks to the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement, and we very much welcome a commitment by the Government to brief all parties in the House on major developments. Can I associate the SNP with the expressions of shock and sadness with the people of France and all families and friends of those who were killed and injured in the Paris attacks. Will the Prime Minister confirm that all assistance, including intelligence information, is being shared with our allies in France? In the UK, we are hugely indebted to all of those in our police and security services who work to keep us safe. We welcome the commitment by the Prime Minister to provide necessary funding and personnel to allow them to do this vital work. Given the scale of the disaster in Syria, we welcome the progress at the talks in Vienna and at the G20 in Turkey. For the first time, there appears to be momentum building to secure a ceasefire to work through the United Nations and to combat the terrorism of Daesh. Can the Prime Minister update the House on the next diplomatic steps towards a potential ceasefire and political transition in Syria? Mr. Speaker, in recent weeks and months, there has been large-scale bombing operations in Syria. There's been bombing by the United States of America. There's been bombing by Russia. There has been bombing by France and many other countries. There have been bombs dropped by drones, bombs dropped from fast jets, and missiles fired from naval vessels. President Obama has reiterated his opposition to providing boots on the ground. Given these facts, does the Prime Minister agree that the long-term solution for Syria is an end to the civil war and supporting forces like the Kurds who are currently fighting Daesh on the ground? Today we have seen the arrival of refugees from Syria in Glasgow. These are people who have been fleeing terrorism at home. Does the Prime Minister agree that the welcome we give to these refugees is the true mark of humanity, of decency and compassion? In short, the complete opposite which was visited on Paris by terrorists last Friday.
Well, can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his remarks and questions. I mean, first of all, on the issue of briefings, he is now a Privy Councillor, a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee. If he feels he's not getting enough briefings, or please, ask my team, and I'll make sure he gets them. He asked about intelligence sharing. We have very strong intelligence sharing with the French government and indeed with others in Europe. I think there's more we can do. I spoke to the Belgian Prime Minister yesterday to talk about increasing the extent of our intelligence sharing, and I think that's a vitally important agenda for us to really move on. On Vienna, as he says, I think there is momentum behind these talks. The foreign ministers will be meeting again in the coming weeks, but right now the role is falling to Staffan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy, to bring the different parties together. It's a very complex piece of work because it's absolutely vital that some of the Syrian opposition groups are involved in this dialogue. We want a future Syria where Sunni, Shia, Kurd and Christian are all represented, and that means that the Russians should stop bombing the Free Syrian Army and recognise that they should be part of the future of Syria. The point he makes about how much can be done from the air, of course what we need is an end to this civil war, but he goes on to say we need to support the Kurds. Yes, we do, and some of that support can be delivered from the air. They need our help to bring this conflict to an end. And his remarks about Syrian refugees, let me commend what Glasgow is doing in taking Syrian refugees. I'm confident we will have 1,000 here by Christmas, and I know they'll be well looked after.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for his commitment to a personal reply to the Foreign Affairs Committee report and his acknowledgement that the defeat of ISIL requires a transition out of the Syrian civil war. And the progress made at Vienna is therefore beginning to clear the path towards an international plan that would enable that full conventional military defeat of so-called Islamic State in both Syria and Iraq. Will he continue to put our full diplomatic effort into making that plan sufficiently clear, politically, militarily and legally, so he can come to the House to seek an endorsement of a role for our armed forces that will lead to the defeat of ISIL in both Syria and Iraq sooner rather than later?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for his support and for what he's saying. And I very much welcome what he said today. Yes, I can confirm our full diplomatic effort is towards bringing everyone together. Sitting around the table in Vienna are Saudi Arabia, Iran, Britain, France, America, Turkey, all the key players, Russia, all the key players are there. In terms of the legal basis for any action that we might take, I believe we can answer that question comprehensively as we have on other issues, and I'm very happy to put that in front of the House as part of my response to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will know that ISIL want to exploit the refugee crisis and also to poison Europe's attitudes towards those who are fleeing the very same barbarism that we saw so tragically on the streets of Paris. He's told me before that Britain is supporting proper registration in Greece. I am concerned that that is not happening. Will he look again urgently at what more Britain and Europe can do to support proper registration and border checks, not just in Greece but in internal borders throughout Europe, so that we can make sure that we provide both security and humanitarian aid that we desperately need, so Britain and Europe can support both our security and our solidarity with desperate refugees?
No, I thank the right lady for what she says. She's absolutely right that as the external border of Europe, Greece plays an absolutely vital role, and the registration of migrants as they arrive is absolutely vital that takes place properly. My understanding is that when it comes to the European Asylum Support Offer, ESO, we've actually given more, I think, than any other country in Europe. So we're certainly putting the resources in, even though effectively for us, Greece is not our external border. Our external border is the border controls at Calais, because we're not part of Schengen. So we are doing what we can. We'll continue to see whether there's more that can be done, but she's right that making sure people are properly documented as they arrive is going to be a vital part of our security.
Sir William Cash.
The planned carnage in Paris shows the danger of allowing declared jihadists from returning to their country of origin. Will my right honourable friend be good enough to review the counter-terrorism legislation to prevent declared UK jihadists from returning to the United Kingdom, whatever human rights or the Charter of Fundamental Rights may say? We must put the people of this country and their lives before human rights.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his point, and I have a huge amount of sympathy with it, and that's why in the counter-terrorism legislation that we passed, we took further steps to confiscate people's passports. If someone is a dual national, we can strip them of their UK citizenship if we think that they no longer merit citizenship of this country. We also have the temporary power now, which was controversial, but the Home Secretary and I pushed it forward, to temporarily exclude even British nationals from returning to the UK. I'm all for looking at options for going further on these measures to make sure we keep ourselves safe, but it was very contentious at the time, and I think this is demonstrating we were right to stick to our guns.
Tim Farron.
Speaker, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for the advanced sight of his statement, and indeed to join him and colleagues on all sides here today in expressing solidarity, compassion and sympathy to the people of Paris and Beirut, and especially to the injured and those who have lost their lives and the families of them, and to utterly condemn the terrorists who seek to attack us. They detest our diversity, our freedom and our generosity of spirit, and we let them win if we compromise on any of those things. It is critical that any UK military involvement in Syria should focus on civilian protection and political transition alongside crushing ISIL. Otherwise, we repeat the mistakes of the illegal and counterproductive Iraq war. So, does the Prime Minister agree that the long-term stability in Syria must then be part of the strategy against ISIL? And will he confirm that any plan brought to Parliament by the government to use our armed forces there will specifically address this?
Well, first of all, let me say how I think he's absolutely right to mention the bombing in Beirut, because, of course, some people want to posit that this is somehow a sort of clash of civilizations, the Islamic world against the rest. And actually, the Beirut bomb, as so many other bombs before it, proved that these people, in this case ISIL, are killing Muslims in the hundreds and thousands. And I think it's very important also to demonstrate to Muslim communities in our own countries that we take this violence as seriously as violence when it is committed in Paris or elsewhere. He asked whether what we would do in Syria would be about civilian protection. My argument is yes, it would be about civilian protection in the obvious way that if we can take out the murderers of ISIL, we're helping to protect the Syrian people who they are threatening, but also because Britain has precision munitions like the Brimstone missile that are in many ways more effective even than some of the things the Americans have. Our intervention and our assistance would actually mean a better targeting of the people who should be targeted and fewer civilian casualties.
Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
In his very welcome statement today, my right honourable friend is clearly absolutely right to focus on the political track in the Syrian negotiations, building in part on the Kofi Annan proposals from some time ago, but also the significant progress that appears to have been made in Vienna last week. If those negotiations are successful, that will of itself remove a huge barrier to the widespread military coalition that all of us want to see, and in which Britain, as he said today, would have the ability and indeed a number of unique assets to play a very significant part. Can I say that if those negotiations in Vienna are successful, I have no doubt that the Prime Minister coming back to this House will get a huge majority of members from both sides in Britain's full participation in it.
Minister.
Well, what I would say to my right honourable friend, who I know follows these things very closely, I think makes some very good points, is, of course, as I've said, to defeat ISIL in Syria, two things are required. First of all, we do need to make sure that the international community, the Arab states and others, are taking the military action to degrade and defeat ISIL, but we need a political settlement that gives us an effective ally in Syria to defeat ISIL in a way that can unite the country. Those two things go together, but if he's arguing that military action should only follow after some political agreement has been absolutely nailed down, I think we might be waiting a very long time for that to happen, and I'd caution against that approach. And I want to be absolutely clear about what I'm proposing here. What I'm saying is that the government will bring together all of its arguments about how we succeed in Iraq, how we succeed in Syria, what a political process should achieve, how we degrade and defeat ISIL, the role that Britain should play, my argument that we should be going further in Syria as well as Iraq, putting all those arguments together in response to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Then it will be for members of this House to see if they want to come forward and assent to that idea. And then, if that happens, then we can have the vote and take the action so that we are playing a part with others in defence of our own national security.
Order, can I just very gently say to the House, I'm very conscious that there are many colleagues here who cannot be accused of underestimating their own expertise in these important matters, but there are nearly 60 people still wishing to contribute, and if I'm to have any chance of accommodating them all, they will all need to follow the rubric of brevity, now to be demonstrated to perfection by Gisela Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's commitment to a wider narrative of explaining how he thinks Daesh can be defeated, and his insistence that it has to be done with our allies. Press reports this morning suggest that France has invoked the mutual defence clause in the Lisbon Treaty for the first time. Could the Prime Minister explain to the House what practical implications that may have for the United Kingdom and our cooperation?
I'm grateful that the Honourable Lady raises this. It's not a clause that's been invoked in my understanding before, so we're looking very carefully at exactly what it would involve. But I think standing back from the legalities of it, it's very clear. The French are our friends, they're our allies, they're our brothers and sisters, and we should be absolutely with them. And if there are things we can do to help them, I say we should.
Dame Angela Watkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the extreme circumstances of a Paris-type attack in London, does my right honourable friend think that depriving the police of the right to shoot to kill would make the public safer?
No, I absolutely don't, and I hope that the Leader of the Opposition will review his remarks, because, frankly, when you are combating a terrorist attack, and if we look at what happened in Paris, it was an attack, it wasn't a siege, it wasn't taking hostages and setting out demands, it was an attempt to kill as many people as possible. And when the police are confronted by that, they must be absolutely clear that if they have to take out a terrorist to save lives, they should go right ahead and do so.
Mr. David Winnick.
Is he aware that those of us who are not persuaded, at least at this stage, that extending airstrikes to Syria have no less hatred for the mass murderers who have carried out so many atrocities, the latest being in Paris, or because we're pacifists or semi-pacifists, I'm certainly not so and never likely to be, or because, to be frank, the internal politics of the Labour Party. It is because, as the Foreign Affairs Committee has concluded, that there doesn't seem to be a strong case for so extending airstrikes, that it will achieve little or nothing and simply make us feel good and that we're doing something as a result of the atrocities.
Prime Minister! I don't agree with that view, but look, I respect the fact that it is for the government to bring forward the argument, to make the case and to seek to persuade as many members of this House that it's the right thing to do. I think the people who oppose this have to answer the question, why is it right to take out ISIL in Iraq, but wrong to take out ISIL in Syria, particularly when it's in Syria that the headquarters of ISIL is, and it's from Syria that the attacks on this country have been planned, and for all we know, continued to be planned. That's the question that I think colleagues will have to answer after reading my response to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. If we can get to the situation where it looks like Britain, as one, can come together, I'm not asking for an overwhelming majority, just a majority would be good enough, a majority to come forward and say, this is right for us to take this action.
Mr. Keith Simpson.
The Prime Minister is only too well aware that given the nature of those returning from serving in Syria who served with ISIL and the danger that they have to our society, what measures is the government taking to persuade those who can to speak out against what has happened, because they are more likely to influence young Muslims than any of us?
No, my honourable friend is absolutely right. There are obviously those huge numbers in Britain's Muslim communities who've absolutely made clear that what is being done by ISIL is not in their name, that they are not representatives of Islam, they're a perversion of Islam, and that's incredibly powerful, and I'd encourage all those people who've already made such an effort, please go on doing that. But he's right. Those people who've been to Syria, perhaps as part of an aid convoy, who've really seen what has happened and have come back rightly disillusioned by the butchery of these people, by their hatred of people with different ways of life, by the appalling way they treat women as sex slaves, by the way they throw gay people off the top of buildings. People who come back disillusioned, they can be some of the most powerful voices for saying that these are not people we can deal with, these are people we've got to finish.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I, on behalf of my right honourable and honourable friends who have experienced over many, many years the ravages of terrorism personally and at close quarters, express our full support for the Prime Minister and his words and actions in recent days in relation to these terrible events in Paris and elsewhere, and express our profound sympathies with the people affected. In relation to counter-terrorism, would the Prime Minister agree that the security services need the resources, and I very much welcome what has been said in recent days, they need the powers, and we look forward to working with the government to introduce more powers with proper ministerial oversight, but they also need our support, the public support, and the support of politicians. When they need to shoot to kill, they need our support. And I welcome what the Prime Minister has said about the shameful trait, expressed sadly by some even in this House, of seeking to blame the terrorist victims for contributing to their own murders through saying that the foreign policy of this country is wrong. This is a shameful approach. Terrorism has no excuses. It never had any excuses. And the people who express such sentiment should be ashamed of themselves.
As has often been the case in recent days and recent weeks, the honourable gentleman speaks with great power, great force, and I agree with what he says.
Ms. Ratghani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as action from our armed forces, security forces and the police, we also need to tackle the ideology that lies behind the threat that we face. Does the Prime Minister agree that as part of that we need to support those who challenge the extremists, expose Daesh as a death cult, and also support the communities who feel vulnerable at the spread of Wahhabism within the UK, and help stop more people sliding into extremism?
Minister. I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. I think for too long in some European countries, governments have felt that the way to handle community relations is to leave people in different silos and listen to self-appointed community leaders rather than engaging directly with people. And when it comes to this battle against extremism, we shouldn't be neutral. We should be very clear about those groups we will engage with because they back the values we share, and those that we don't agree with and frankly we think might be part of the problem. And greater clarity on this, I think, is probably not just necessary in Britain. I expect it's going to be necessary in other parts of Europe too.
Keith Vaz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday evening at Wembley Stadium, when the Prime Minister shared a platform with Prime Minister Modi, he made a speech about being proud to be the leader of the most multicultural country in the world. Does he agree with me that in order to protect and preserve that, we need to be very aggressive in our counter-narrative? And that means the internet companies doing much more than they are currently doing in order to take away the most important method of recruitment. And internationally, it means working with Europol and Interpol, giving them the support that they need, as this is an international issue.
Minister. Well, first of all, can I thank him for the support that he gave to the Indian Prime Minister's visit to our country last week. And what I said, standing alongside Prime Minister Modi, is that while, of course, we still have to fight discrimination and racism in our country, I think we can lay some claim to being one of the most successful multiracial, multi-faith, multi-ethnic democracies in our world, something India aspires to do as well, and it should be something that links us. He's right about this issue of working with internet companies, just as we've worked with them to try to take paedophilia and child pornography off the internet. So there's more we can do to get this extremism off the internet as well.
Mr. John Barron.
The Prime Minister is right to focus on the importance of a multifaceted approach, but may I suggest to him that when it comes to military intervention in Syria, we must learn from previous errors and try to ensure that we put together a proper strategy involving regional powers and allies, the powers including Iran and Russia, which might have to recognise that ISIL is the greater danger than President Assad, because we also need to accept that airstrikes alone will not defeat this evil regime.
Prime Minister. Well, my honourable friend is right that bringing together an international coalition for political change in Syria is the right thing to do, and that's exactly what we're doing. Iran and Saudi Arabia and Russia and America, Britain, France, Turkey and others are all in the room together negotiating this, and that is the way it should be. But I also think we have to have a regard to our own national security, and every day that ISIL is active in Iraq and Syria is a day that we are in some danger in our own country.
Mr. Leslie.
The Prime Minister is right that the police and the security services need our full support at this time. But shouldn't it be immediately obvious to everyone, that the police need the full and necessary powers, including the proportionate use of lethal force if needs be, to keep our communities safe?
Well, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right. I think we can have a huge regard for our police in this country. The old saying that the public are the police and the police are the public does ring true, because they come from our communities. They're not seen as some occupying force. And it's absolutely right, when they're confronting murderers and people with weapons, they have to be able on occasion to take lethal action. And I hope that the Leader of the Opposition will think very carefully about what he said, because it's very important we all support the police in the work they do rather than undermine it.
Seema Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend set out what plans the government is taking to make airport security safer, given the belief that we have that the Russian airline was brought down by a bomb?
Minister.
Well, what we've seen this morning is some reports that the Russian security services are now making clear that they believe it was a bomb that brought down that aircraft tragically after it left Sharm el-Sheikh. And this is an issue I discussed with President Putin yesterday. What we need to do is to work with others to look at the most vulnerable locations around the world and work out how we can make them more safe. There's no 100% security you can deliver, even in the most advanced airport, but there are some basic things around scanners, about the way luggage is handled, about the way passengers interact with their luggage, about what happens at the gate, best practice that can be introduced right across the world, and that's what we're going to work on.
Mr. Alex Salmon.
If a broad international coalition is not just possible but necessary in Syria, then what is the obstacle to a Security Council resolution? And on the subject of financial flows, can the Prime Minister answer the question directly? What are the obstacles to disrupting and degrading the financial flows and the financial institutions without whom Daesh could not function?
First of all, the obstacle so far to a Security Council resolution has been the fact that one of the permanent members, Russia, has threatened to veto meaningful Security Council resolutions that would perhaps provide that overarching permission for the action that we believe is necessary in Syria. But I'll answer the question very directly in my response to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee that the action I believe we should take is legal under international law. And I know that should be spelled out clearly, and of course I will spell it out clearly. In terms of disrupting the financial flows, we actually are part of the committee that is looking at all the action that can be taken, including against financial institutions. But as I said, one of the most important things we can do is stop their funding through the oil trade, some of which they're selling directly to Assad.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Earlier this year, the Kingdom of Morocco signed an agreement with France to train imams and preachers, including women, in the moderate mainstream tradition to which my right honourable friend referred. Would he congratulate Morocco for the exceptional leadership that it has displayed in tackling extremism and commend its further efforts, perhaps as far as the UK is concerned, where we can learn some of the lessons that France is currently undergoing?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. We can learn the lesson from Morocco. There's also work the German government has been doing with Turkish imams. There's work we've been doing with imams trained to come into this country. One of the remarkable things about the G20 is actually the conversation about fighting radicalisation and extremism. The proposals made by, for instance, the Indonesian president and the Malaysian prime minister, both countries that pride themselves on being part of the moderate Muslim world, were particularly powerful to listen to.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst we differ on the details of how to ensure citizens are kept safe, I certainly agree that it is the overwhelming priority of the government to make sure that they are. And in that vein, can he assure us that as well as giving extra money to the security services, he will also make a significant investment in our diplomatic services, which are world-class and are needed more than ever right now? It should not be hollowed out by cuts.
Minister. Our diplomatic posts play an absolutely vital role in Britain's soft power, and we were ranked the other day as #1 in the world for soft power. We've been opening embassies around the world rather than closing them, and it's a good opportunity to thank all our hard-working staff from this dispatch box.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To counter the appalling slaughter that was faced by all those in Paris, we will need armed police on the spot within minutes. Can the Prime Minister, our honourable friend, reassure the House that we have sufficient armed police in all our cities to do just that in that?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this, and following the Mumbai attacks and the intelligence we had after that of potential attacks in this country, a lot of work was done to make sure that the armed response vehicles we have sufficient amount of people to meet the challenge in any of our major urban areas. We keep this under review. We're studying what happened in Paris. We're looking at the numbers that we need. I think the idea of routinely arming all of the police in our country is not the right approach, but certainly increasing the number of armed police that are available, that is something that we're looking at very carefully, and something that, if necessary, we'll do. And also, while we don't talk about the role of our special forces, they're also available to help in these circumstances. And again, we'll do everything we can to make sure that they can be brought to bear at the right moment and can help with our overall effort at dealing with what are extremely challenging problems thrown up by what happened in Paris.
Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that full responsibility for the attacks in Paris lies solely with the terrorists, and that any attempt by any organisation to somehow blame the West or France's military intervention in Syria is not only wrong, disgraceful, but also should be condemned?
The response right across the House shows how right the Honourable Lady is. It's worth remembering as well, to those who think that somehow this is all caused by Iraq, France didn't take part in the Iraq war. Indeed, they condemned it. The fact is about these ISIL terrorists, they hate our way of life. They want to kill and maim as many people as possible. They also do this to Muslims with whom they disagree, and that is why we have to confront and defeat and not compromise or excuse in any way this vile organisation.
James Morris.
Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, particularly his commitment to come to the House with an argument for extending British military action to Syria. But would he agree with me that the threat we face from ISIL is such a current threat to our national security, and it's timely, that he may have to take action as Prime Minister without coming back to this House in order to protect our national security?
Well, I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman for raising this question. I've always said very clearly at this dispatch box that in the case of premeditated action, for instance against ISIL in Syria, then it's right that we have a debate and a vote, and I'm happy to repeat that again. But I do reserve the right, taking action against in the national interest, where you have to take action very quickly, very rapidly, and you need the confidentiality before you take it, as it were. I'm prepared to act. That's what I did in the case of Hussein and Khan with the UK drone strike, and obviously with Emwazi, where we were working hand in glove with the Americans. I think then it was right to take that action and explain afterwards, but I'll try and stick to that clear demarcation. I think that's the right approach for our country.
Douglas Carswell.
I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, and I'm sure that sensible people on both sides of the House will support sensible measures in the days and weeks ahead. Has the government given any consideration to the way in which the government of Saudi Arabia perhaps exports and funds and encourages radicalism, and is this something that we should address with a view to making sure they don't radicalise young people in the UK?
No, I think the honourable gentleman makes an important point. I mean, I met with the King of Saudi Arabia at the G20, and we discussed the situation in Syria. I think it's fair to say that Saudi Arabia has actually quite a strong de-radicalisation program for its own citizens who have become extremists, and it has been successful in that. But we do need to ask, as I've said more broadly, about how we stop people setting off down the path to extremism in the first place. And that is important in terms of what is taught in schools and how it's taught, and how we make sure that in all our educational practices right across the world, whether we are Christians, Jews, Muslims or Hindus, that we're teaching tolerance and understanding right from the very start.
Mark Field.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst I suspect many, both in this House and beyond, will find it unpalatable that we are talking with President Putin at this time, I fully support and wholeheartedly support the Prime Minister in having those discussions. Just to pick up on a point that was made by the Right Honourable Gentleman for Gordon, is it the case that the government is still trying to work towards getting a UN Security Council resolution on these matters, hand in glove with the other strategy to which he has referred?
We keep talking with Security Council partners about potential resolutions that we could put forward on any number of issues to do with this overall problem of ISIL and Iraq and Syria. But in terms of something that backs the sort of military action we've spoken about in this House, that hasn't been possible up to now because of the Russian potential veto. And I think it is important for us to understand that it is possible to act within international law, with a full backing of international law, without a Security Council resolution. Obviously, it's better in many ways to have a Security Council resolution as well. But we cannot outsource our national security to a Russian veto, or indeed a veto by anybody else.
Matt McFadden.
Can I ask the Prime Minister to reject the view that sees terrorist acts as always being a response or a reaction to what we in the West do? Yeah. Does he agree with me that such an approach risks infantilizing the terrorists and treating them as children, when the truth is they are adults entirely responsible for what they do? No one forces them to kill innocent people in Paris or Beirut, and unless we are clear about that, we will fail even to be able to understand the threat that we face, let alone confront it and ultimately overcome it.
I think it is that sort of moral and intellectual clarity that is necessary in dealing with terrorists. I know there's something deep in all of us to try and find an excuse or an explanation or an understanding, but sometimes the answer is there staring us in the face, and with ISIL that is absolutely the case.
Will Quince. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of Colchester and North Essex mourn the loss of Nick Alexander. Nick died doing the job that he loved, giving pleasure to others, music. Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to Nick but also reaffirming our resolve that we will not allow these murderous cowards to destroy our way of life.
Well, I certainly join my honourable friend in paying tribute to Nick and to say that our thoughts are with his family and his friends. What ISIL was trying to do was to destroy our way of life and our value systems and the things that people like to do in their spare time. And one of the most important things we can do alongside all these security responses is to go on living our lives.
Margaret Ritchie.
Mr. Speaker, and could I thank the Prime Minister for his statement. And on behalf of myself and my two colleagues from the SDLP, I would like to convey our sympathy and our outright opposition to terrorism, because coming from Northern Ireland, we all know what that was like for so many years. But in so doing, we note that the Prime Minister is coming back to the House with a full comprehensive strategy. And in so doing, could he define the term that he referred to earlier, action that would be legal under international law?
Minister.
What I've said I would do is that as part of the strategy that I will lay out in response to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee report, is set out as one part of that strategy why I think we should be taking action not just in Iraq but in Syria too, and in doing so we'll set out the legal advice for that. And I think it's very important that the House sees that. You can already see with the action we're taking in Iraq that we're taking that action at the request of the legitimate Iraqi government. You can see with the action we've taken so far against Mohammed Emwazi or Khan and Hussein that was also on the basis of self-defense of the United Kingdom. Now, I can lay out very clearly these arguments about why we should be doing it, how we shall help to keep ourselves safe, why it's in our interests of national security, but I'll make sure that in this paper it addresses those legal arguments as well.
Craig Whittaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the second massacre in Paris last weekend, our own citizens in Tunisia murdered, and the plethora of Daesh-led massacres over the last year, can I say that now is not the time for knee-jerk reactions, but a time to reflect and plan effectively. Can I ask my right honourable friend if he will do everything in his power to stop and destroy this murderous regime that is Daesh for the sake of our own national security, for which he has my 100% support, as no doubt he does for many members in this House.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his support? I don't believe in knee-jerk reactions. Rightly, though, when something like Paris happens, it's worth asking every single question about our state of preparedness, about how we'd respond to this, about our intelligence cooperation. That's exactly what we're doing, and I think it's right we do.
Mike Gapes.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's content and tone of his statement spoke not just for the government but for the country. And he referred to the Mount Sinjar and the retaking of Sinjar by Kurdish forces supported by the international coalition. On Saturday, as a member of the all-party parliamentary group visit, I was with the Kurds in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, at the front line south of Kirkuk. Those Kurdish forces are brave. They're putting their lives on the line every day. They did so at Sinjar, along with the Syrian Kurds. Can we do more to provide material support for the Peshmerga of Iraqi Kurdistan, and also, pending a decision on whether we go into Syria, give more support from the air to the Kurds in Iraq now?
Very grateful to the honourable gentleman for what he said. The answer to his questions is yes. We are already, as he knows, providing training and support to the Kurdish Peshmerga forces. They're incredibly brave, they're incredibly dedicated. They've done a brilliant job liberating people from ISIL dominance. We discussed yesterday with President Obama and the French, German and Italian leaders what more we could do. Germany is already doing a lot in that area. We're doing a lot, and there's more certainly we can do.
Waitley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's commitment to defeating ISIL in Syria as well as in Iraq, and his commitment to continue to make the case to this House and to the electorate. Can I ask him to do so as part of a long-term vision for stability in the region?
No, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. People want to know that our response is not driven by anger, but is driven by resolve and is thoughtful and thought through and will make us safer and the region more stable. and I'm convinced we can answer all those questions in the document I'll put in front of the House.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the comments by my right honourable friend, the member for Murray, welcoming the refugees arriving in Glasgow today? But can I ask the Prime Minister, with regard to the Paris climate change talks, what further discussions were held at the G20 and whether he personally plans to attend those talks in Paris as an act of leadership and solidarity?
Yes, I will certainly be there at the start of the talks on Monday. The discussions at the G20 were positive in that, again, everyone committed to having the aim of below 2 degrees. My concern is that some of the things that are necessary to make this agreement really meaningful, like 5-year reviews and the rest of it, there's still some opposition from some countries to that, and we still haven't had every country's independent proposal for how they reduce their own carbon emissions. So there's important work to be done. We can use the Commonwealth Conference for part of that. Britain is playing its part. There will be an agreement, I'm confident of that. It will involve Russia and China. We're now battling for a good agreement rather than just a mediocre one.
Lee Morton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that our overriding priority must be the security of our country and its people? And recognising that the threat we face from terrorists today is not just about bullets and bombs, but it's also about cyber attacks. And will he ensure we have the right funding and organisations in place to deal with this threat?
No, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We do face cyber attacks, not just from states, but also from radical groups and individuals. I think we made a lot of progress in recent years at funding our cyber defences, but I think it should be a major feature of the Strategic Defence Review we discuss next week.
David Hanson.
The first duty of government is to protect its citizens, and the Prime Minister has set out with absolute clarity the steps required to do that, for which it is welcome. Could he, though, say some more about what steps he will take to secure action against those who are buying goods of contraband from ISIL, not just the Syrian government, but also individuals and companies?
No, well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his remarks. There is the sale of antiquities, of course, which he might be referring to, as well as, of course, the sale of oil. And we're trying to crack down on all of those things. And we're looking at what more we might have to do in this country to assent to some of the conventions in that area.
Order. I think it's reasonable to move on at 2 o'clock and not beyond. So can I appeal for brevity? Colleagues helping each other. That would be really useful. Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Along with the Honourable Member for Ilford South and also the Honourable Members for South Antrim and Barrow, I join them on the front line against ISIL-Daesh south of Kirkuk in Iraqi Kurdistan last weekend, where indeed we saw the amazing work that the Peshmerga is doing in taking back territory and communities from that evil existence. We also visited some refugee and displacement camps and saw families affected. Would my right honourable friend the Prime Minister agree with me that we need to ensure that we are protecting those minorities in the Middle East?
Prime Minister. My honourable friend is absolutely right. Making sure that both Iraq and Syria are countries and governments that represent all of their people, Sunni, Shia and Kurd, is absolutely vital.
A question, perhaps? Chukwuemeka.
I agree with all the comments about the number one priority of this government being safeguarding the national security of those we represent, but actually that extends to every single member of this House. With regard to the use of lethal force by intelligence and police forces abroad and at home, of course it's important that they have the powers necessary to act. But it's also important that they act within a clear legal framework. I welcome the Prime Minister agreeing to publish the advice on which he intends to act in Syria. Could he also ensure that the basis on which police act on our streets here is published and made known to those we represent?
Minister. Thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Let me clarify something, because I don't want to mislead the House. I'm not saying I will publish the legal advice, because governments have never done that. What I did as Prime Minister in the last government, and will do again in this, is provide a proper and full description of what that legal advice says. I know that sounds like splitting hairs, but it is important. That's what I will do. As for the issue that he raises about the police, perhaps I'll ask the Home Secretary to write to him directly about that.
After his uninterrupted 28 years' service in the House, I feel sure the honourable gentleman member for Bosworth can put a question very likely in a single sentence, and briefly. Mr. Tredynick.
Well, friend, the Prime Minister heard anything about the possibility of partition as a settlement on the lines of Cyprus, leaving an Alawite 5-tribal area in the south and Free Syria in the north?
I don't think, I have seen ideas put forward for these sorts of things. I don't think it's the right idea. I think the idea of trying to carve up these countries into a sort of Sunnistan and a Shiastan, I think would be a great mistake. What we need to do is build a Syria that can have a government that represents all of its people as Syrians.
Mr. Brake. Mr. Thomas.
I have met a number of Syrians over the last couple of weeks, including a very brave citizen journalist who is about to return to Syria. They are unanimous in calling for a no-bombing zone in Syria to stop civilians being killed by Assad's barrel bombs. Can the Prime Minister reassure us that he will ensure that the views of Syrian civilians are taken into account in relation to any UK military action?
No, the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. I mean, if we were to take action, it would be to save the lives of Syrian civilians. Of course, we all support no bombing zones in terms of Assad stopping the practice of raining down barrel bombs, sometimes with chemical weapons, on his own people. And that is why, while we should be very focused on ISIL, we cannot forget that President Assad has been one of the recruiting sergeants for ISIL, and his brutality keeps providing fresh recruits. And so the idea you can just take sides and team up with Assad against ISIL is an entirely false prospectus.
Mr. David Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement? And in light of the terrorist attacks in Paris, I believe our police and security services urgently need the new powers set out in the draft Investigatory Powers Bill now. Can I therefore urge and ask my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, to consider speeding up the pre-legislative scrutiny procedure and bring forward the date when this vital bill will reach the statute book?
I thank my honourable friend for this question. We are looking at this issue, but I would reassure him that most of what the IP bill does is put onto an even clearer statutory footing those practices currently carried out by our security and intelligence services. There's one element that is particularly important that is new, which relates to internet connection records, which is probably the most controversial part of the bill, and I don't want to jeopardise this bill by rushing it. But I hope he's reassured we'll look at the timing, but most of the powers are about being put on a clearer legal basis.
Mr. Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, arguably the most successful forces against Daesh on the ground in Iraq and Syria have been the Peshmerga. What diplomatic pressure can the UK government put on certain allies who are undermining their capabilities?
Prime Minister.
Well, what we're doing is everything we can to help their capabilities. So training, ammunition, logistical support, that's coming from us, that's coming from the Germans, that's coming from the Americans. And obviously we need to work very hard with all of the countries in the region to recognise that the Kurds are our allies in this fight, not least because they're taking it directly to ISIL and saving civilian lives.
Mr. Jason McCartney.
Mr. Speaker, as chairman of the all-party group for Kurdistan, I join the Prime Minister in praising the Peshmerga forces for retaking Sinjar with support by US-led airstrikes. And does the Prime Minister agree with me that these Kurdish forces now need their fair share of oil revenues promised from Baghdad for them to be able to continue this fight on the ground against the evil ISIL Daesh?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend has a lot of experience of working with and helping the Kurds, not least for when he was taking part in delivering an earlier no-fly zone. There is an agreement in Iraq about the sharing of oil revenues, but it needs to be honoured properly because the Iraqi government needs to always make clear that it's there not just for the Shia, but for the Sunnis and the Kurds as well.
Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister share his views and that of the G20 on the creation of a safe zone for civilians within Syria?
Prime Minister.
But as I've said before at this dispatch box, we're always happy to look at these suggestions, but when it comes to safe zones, you have to remember that you can't declare them without making them fully safe. And in order to do that, you might have to take very severe military action against Syrian air defences, Syrian aircraft, Syrian command and control, and all the rest of it. And you might have to have troops to make that zone safe as well. So I think there are real problems with these suggestions. I look at them. I've discussed them with the Turks, for instance, a huge amount. There's also another danger worth thinking about, which is that there are 2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. If they felt a safe zone was being created in order to push them out of Turkey and into Syria, that actually might hasten their move to come to Europe. So all these things have to be considered. But at the end of the day, safe zones are only proxies for what really needs to happen, which is the destruction of ISIL and the political transition in Syria.
Andrew Bingham.
There's an assertion that at least one of the perpetrators of the Paris atrocity came into Europe under the guise of being a refugee. Can my right honourable friend give an assurance that as we welcome, and I emphasise the word welcome, genuine refugees into our country, that proper security checks will be carried out to ensure that ISIL supporters don't get in under the radar in a similar way?
My honourable friend makes a good point, and he also puts his question absolutely in the right way. We mustn't confuse migration and terrorism, but we do need to be clear that proper border controls or checks are necessary to make sure the people who come to our country don't threaten us. And this is one of the reasons why we never joined Schengen. We wanted to keep our own border controls, and indeed taking our Syrian refugees from the camps enables us to carry out checks before they take off.
Jeremy.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right that greater powers are necessary to thwart terrorist internet plots. The Prime Minister is also right to make available additional resources for our security services and our special forces. Does the Prime Minister, however, not agree that it would be the worst possible time now to proceed with the biggest cuts to any police service in Europe, which would have a serious impact on neighbourhood policing, vital to intelligence gathering, the eyes and ears of counter-terrorism in local communities?
Minister.
Well, as I've said, we have protected counter-terrorism policing budgets in the last Parliament. We'll do the same in this Parliament. I think the police have shown in the last 5 years how well they can do at finding efficiencies and actually increasing the number of neighbourhood police officers that are on our streets.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Terrorists and their weapons can enter the UK through any point of entry, and the ports that mainly handle freight, such as the Humber port, are perhaps particularly vulnerable. Can my right honourable friend assure me that staff levels for Border Force will be maintained and, if necessary, enhanced to combat this threat?
Well, my honourable friend is right to raise this issue. What I can tell him is that we're very focused on preventing firearms from entering our country. That is one of the best ways we can try and defend ourselves from these sorts of appalling attacks. We have an intelligence-led model where we try and use intelligence to make sure that our border security is delivered in the right way at the right time. But all the time we're asking Border Force whether they have what they need. I discussed this with the head of Border Force who attended the Cobra meeting on Saturday morning when we discussed this.
Mr. Ian Austin.
Mr. Speaker, I agreed with everything the Prime Minister said about Syria and about terrorism, but does he agree with me that those who say that Paris is reaping the whirlwind of Western policy, or who want to say that Britain's foreign policy has increased, not diminished, the threats to our own national security, are not just absolving the terrorists of responsibility, but risk fueling the sense of grievance and resentment which can develop into extremism and terrorism?
That was a moment when he the honourable gentleman very kindly said he agreed with me, and I absolutely agree with him. We have to be very clear to those people who are at risk of being radicalised that this sort of excuse culture is wrong. And it's not only wrong for us to argue, for anyone to argue, that Paris was brought about by Western policy. It is also very damaging for young Muslims growing up in Britain to think that any reasonable person could have this view. So I agree with him 100%.
Nigel Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister believe that any individuals living in the United Kingdom now who have information about any activities of those who have become radicalised or are terrorists themselves are silent accomplices to any carnage that might take place in this country, and that they have a duty to pass on that information immediately in order to save the lives of so many innocent people?
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point. and it actually goes to this issue about the civil liberties that we have in our country. People who might suspect that a friend or a relative or someone they know has become radicalised, or their mind has been poisoned, they should come forward, secure in the knowledge that everything we do in this country is done under the law, under the rule of law, and I think we can't send that message out clearly enough.
Ian Paisley.
In this age of terrorism, can the Prime Minister indicate to us how safe are the British people?
Minister.
Well, I don't set the alert levels. They're set independently, and that's right that it should be done by a group of experts. The level is currently set at severe, which means that they believe an attack is highly likely. The next step you would go to is critical, where you believe that a threat is imminent. That wouldn't normally happen until you have some intelligence that would tell you that a threat was in some way imminent. So what I'd say to the British people is we should go about our lives, we should be vigilant and work with the police and intelligence services where we can, but never give in to the threat that the terrorists pose, because of course they want us to change our way of life and to live in fear. That is what terrorism means.
Mr. Christopher Pincher.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that for terrorists to pursue their evil trade most effectively, they require training, and training requires territory? So action to reduce ISIL's territory, whether it be in Iraq or Syria or anywhere else, is a vital component to ridding the world of these evil people.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and it goes actually to the point the honourable member for Dudley made, which is so much of what our policy over previous years has been to try and close down the ungoverned spaces where terrorists are able to stay and are able to train. And that's why we cannot sit back from all these things. That's why we're engaged in trying to make Somalia into a proper functioning country. It's why we took action in Afghanistan to try and stop that country being a haven for terror. It's why we can't stand by while there fails to be a Libyan government. We've got to work harder to bring about some rule of law and order in that country. We don't do this because somehow we believe in military adventurism. We do this because we want to keep people safe in our own country. That's what it's about.
Richard Burden.
I join the Prime Minister in expressing some cautious optimism that the Vienna process could advance the prospects for a sustainable peace in Syria. Something that's important given the huge numbers that have died there and the millions that have been displaced, but also the horrors of Paris and Beirut remind us of its importance to defeating Daesh as well. When he comes back to the House with his response to the Foreign Affairs Committee report, can I emphasise to him the importance of a strategy being in there? I understand that he'll want to advance the case for military action, but what a lot of us will be looking at is how that fits into an overall strategy, including the involvement of regional powers in the area.
Well, I hope I'll be able to reassure the honourable gentleman. There is a strategy, and we need to lay it out more clearly, which is combining this political settlement with the military action that I think is important and the involvement of neighbouring countries. But in the end, we have to decide whether to take this action as part of a strategy. But certainly that is my aim in this document I'll produce.
Mr. Raymond Chishti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fully welcome the Prime Minister's statement. Prime Minister President Hollande has used the exact words, "France is at war with Daesh." John Kerry in Vienna has said we have to defeat Daesh. This evil organisation wants us to call it Islamic State ISIL to get the legitimacy and appeal it wants. Can we join our counterparts and use the word Daesh to get the right terminology?
Well, my honourable friend is slowly winning this battle, and the use of the word Daesh is increasing with every issue of Hansard that is published. The point he makes about the evil we face is right. We know that this group, just as they carried out an attack in Paris, they would be equally content to carry out an attack in Belgium, in Sweden, in Denmark, or here in Britain. They don't do it, they don't not do it because they, feel that somehow we're different. They just haven't yet managed it, and we've got to stop it.
And coffee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, which I fully support? And would he agree that the multiculturalism of our country is more likely to be destroyed if we do not take every possible action to defeat these murderous terrorists?
Minister.
I absolutely agree with the honourable lady, and as we do so, we need to take everyone in our country with us.
Mr. Stuart Jackson.
Can I direct the Prime Minister back to the alarming news that it is reported that 450 violent jihadists returning from the Middle East have been readmitted to the United Kingdom? Will he give an undertaking, a firm undertaking to the House, that he will not rule out any action against these individuals, however robust, tough or draconian, including revoking their passports in order to protect the British public?
Well, my honourable friend is right to make this point. What we have is a system for trying to examine everybody who returns in this way. Some people, as I said, will come home completely disillusioned with what they've seen because it's an appalling regime with appalling practices. But there are people that we'll have to keep a very close eye on and use all the powers that we have at our discretion.
Yeah. Jim Shannon.
Speaker, can I congratulate the Prime Minister on his courage and leadership at this time. There's a need for a new strategy, quite clearly, and the new strategy must come from within this House. Is it not time that the right honourable and honourable members who sit in this chamber took that decision to step out to support you with the new strategy and protect the people, all the people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for what he says. I hope that this response to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee will be something around which members of this House can rally so that we can then move forward in a way that supports our allies and keeps our country safe.
Jake Berry.
My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is aware that Lancashire Constabulary is one of the leading forces in the UK in fighting radicalisation and terrorism. Could he update the House as to what further steps can we take to ensure that our security services and our police forces cooperate fully with each other?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes a good point. We've obviously announced this additional funding for our security forces. I've said what I've said about counter-terrorism policing, but of course there is a need to continue to work on the PREVENT programme, and I'm sure that'll be something that will be addressed by the Home Office in its spending review.
Last but not least, John Nicholson.
Mr. Speaker, can I raise to the Prime Minister disturbing reports of the firebomb attack in the early hours of this morning against the Al Sarouk Cultural Centre in Bishop Briggs, used by Muslim constituents of mine. Can I also alert him to the grotesque racist attack faced by my colleague Hamza Yusuf, MSP, in social media? Will he join me in condemning some of the inflammatory statements in the press attempting to link innocent Muslims with extremism?
Well, I certainly join with the honourable gentleman in condemning these attacks. We should be equally clear that just as anti-Semitism is wrong, Islamophobia is wrong, and right-wing extremism attacking people for their religions is completely wrong. I think this is absolutely vital that we're equally vehement about all of these things.
Order.